Alright, we need to talk about episode 6 of Invincible, because something about this episode feels different, and not in a small way. This isn't just another episode with fights, powers, and destruction. This one is one of those episodes where you can feel the shift happening in real time. Like the show is quietly telling you, yeah, things aren't going back to normal after this. From the very beginning of episode 6, this has this very heavy atmosphere. Everything feels slower and way more tense. More uncomfortable, like every character is walking around carrying something they're not saying out loud. And the craziest part, it's not even about what's happening on the surface. It's about what's building underneath. Let's start with Mark Grayson, because this episode might be one of the clearest signs that he's changing, not just as a hero, but as a person. There's this constant tension in how he reacts to things now. He's quicker to act, but also more unsure, stronger, but more emotionally unstable. And that's honestly kind of terrifying, because it feels like he's slowly moving closer to something he's trying to avoid this entire time. And then you've got Cecil. Yeah, we really need to talk about him. Episode 6 doesn't show Cecil making tough decisions. It shows him making decisions that feel colder than usual, more calculated, and more distant. Almost like he's already accepted that things are going to get worse, and he's preparing for that outcome no matter the cost. And if you want to talk about how Cecil operates, that's a huge red flag, because when he starts thinking like that, people get hurt. But what really pushes this episode into another level is how it handles its tension. There are moments where it feels like something massive is about to happen. Like the show is building towards this huge explosion and then pulls back at the last second. And that's what actually makes it worse, because because now you're just sitting there thinking, okay, so when does it finally happen? And we have to talk about that final stretch of the episode. No spoilers yet, but the way it builds and the way it teases, the way it almost tricks you into thinking one thing is about to happen before flipping it on to you. That's the classic Invincible. It plays with your expectations in a way that feels intentional, like it knows what you're waiting for and choosing the perfect moment to delay it just a little longer. And honestly, that might just be the most important takeaway from episode 6. This episode isn't about payoff. It's about setup. It's about pressure building, and it's about characters being pushed closer to their limits. It's about that uncomfortable feeling that something big is coming, and nobody is really ready for it. So yeah, if you walked away from episode 6 feeling like not much happened, I'd actually argue the exact opposite, because everything happened and it's just beneath the surface. And if this episode is anything to go by, the next few episodes, they're definitely not holding back. Right away, the episode doesn't rush. It slows everything down, and that's important, because Invincible usually opens up with something intense or shocking, but here it leans into this quiet, almost uncomfortable stillness. Everything still feels off, not in an obvious way where you can tell something isn't sitting right. Then we cut to Mark Grayson. And honestly, you can tell something's changed. And it's not just what he says, it's how he says it. There's hesitation and there's tension. There's this underlying frustration that feels like it's been building for multiple episodes now. He's not reacting the same like the version of himself in earlier seasons. Before, he would hesitate because he didn't want to hurt people now. And now it feels like he hesitates because he's afraid of what he might become if he stops holding back. And that's the huge difference. Then the episode brings us to a more grounded level. Conversations feel slower and more serious, more loaded. This is where the show does something really smart. It doesn't spell everything out. Instead, it lets the silence do the work. You've got big talking, but also not talking. In that gap between what's actually said and what's actually felt, that's where the tension is. Now let's talk about Cecil, because even early in the episode, his presence feels different. He's not loud, he's not aggressive, but he's watching. Calculating. Every line he delivers feels like there's a second meaning behind it. And if you pay attention, it almost feels like he already knows something other people don't. And that's classic Cecil, always 10 steps ahead. But in this episode, it feels less like control and more about preparation, like he's bracing for something bad. One thing this opening section does really well is build moral tension without making it obvious. There's no big argument and there's no dramatic speech, but you can feel the divide starting to form. Different characters are clearly starting to link differently about what needs to be or what needs to be done moving forward. And that's important because in this show, those small differences in thinking, they usually turn into big conflicts later. Now, I think some people might watch this part of the episode and think nothing's really happening, but that's not actually true. This is one of those setups where everything is happening internally. The show is building character pressure, emotional instability, moral conflict, and future consequences. It's basically stacking tension piece by piece, so when something finally breaks later on, it's going to hit way harder. And this is where some things get interesting, because the opening has a lot of small details that hint at what's coming. The way Mark reacts slightly faster than usual, and the conversations cut off before they fully resolve. The way Cecil observes instead of intervenes, and the general lack of comfort in every interaction. None of these are accidental, they're all signals. The show is quietly telling you things are not stable right now. So yeah, the first part of episode 6 might not have had explosions or huge fights, but it's doing something arguably more important. It's setting the emotional and psychological foundation for everything that comes next. It's showing us where these characters are mentally, and more importantly, it's showing us how closely they are to breaking. So that's the first part of the episode 6 breakdown, and honestly, when you step back and look at it as a whole, it's kind of crazy how much this episode is doing without really doing anything loud yet. Because there's no massive fight in this opening stretch, no huge twist, and no shocking death or explosion. But what it does have is something arguably more important. It has tension that's building under the surface. What makes this episode more interesting is that it's not trying to grab your attention with big moments. It's trying to sit with you. It's trying to make you notice the silence between characters and the pauses in conversations. The things people usually say but don't. And that's where the pressure is coming from. Because when you really start to break every scene down in this first part, it's actually doing one job. And I know this sounds like a big claim, especially when there are episodes packed with huge fights, insane reveals, and all-out chaos. But this episode, it doesn't rely on any of that. Instead, it does something a lot more subtle and honestly way more dangerous. Because episode 6 isn't trying to shock you right away. It's trying to build pressure quietly and slowly until everything eventually stops. And once you start noticing what's actually going on underneath the surface, you realize this episode is doing a lot more setup than it first appears. So let's break this down. We're going scene by scene through the first half and then build into everything the episode is setting up for later. Cecil, meanwhile, continues to operate in the background like a system running constant calculations. He's not emotional, he's not reactive, he's strategic. And the more the episode progresses, the more it feels like he's trying to stop something. He's trying to manage it. Like he assumes something is bad and it's inevitable. And he's trying to control how bad it gets. This is also where we start seeing clearer differences in how characters approach problems. Some prioritize control, some prioritize freedom, some prioritize survival, and those differences don't explode immediately, but they're there and they matter. Because in storytelling like this, ideological shifts are always the foundation for future conflict. By the time we reach the later portion of this first half, the episode starts to feel heavier. Not louder, but way more heavier. Like every conversation has consequences attached to it. Like every decision is quietly stacking towards something bigger. This is where the episode becomes more interesting because it fully embraces the calm before the storm. Everything is stable, but it doesn't feel stable, and that everything is intentional because the audience is trained to accept impact, to accept disruption, to expect a shift. And this is the kind of episode that doesn't pay off immediately. It pays off later because everything it builds here becomes fuel for what comes next. And that's what makes it effective. It's not trying to impress you in the moment. It's trying to set up something that hits a lot harder. By this point in the final episode, everything starts to feel tighter. Not louder, not more chaotic, just tighter. Like the episodes have been slowly closing the pace around these characters the entire time. And now there's nowhere left for that pressure to go. And what's really interesting is that nobody fully acknowledges out loud. But you can feel the way everyone starts acting differently and slightly more on edge, and slightly more reactive, and less controlled than before. Mark especially starts to feel different here, because this isn't about him. This isn't about him reacting anymore. It's about him realizing that no matter the choices he makes, there's going to be consequences that he can't avoid. And that's one thing that's starting to really weigh on him. It's the version, it's not just what's the right thing to do, it's what version of me is left after I do it. And that kind of thinking is dangerous for someone like Mark. Because once a hero starts overthinking like that, every decision becomes heavier and every outcome feels worse. Cecil, on the other hand, feels way more locked in here. Yeah. Like, he's no longer just observing the situation, he's actively preparing for it to collapse. And the way he handles things starts to feel less like prevention and more like damage control, because he's already accepted that something is going to go wrong. The only thing that he's trying to control now is how bad it gets when it does. And that shift is important because it tells you everything you need to know about how serious things are becoming behind the scenes. What's more interesting, when you reach the final stretch of calm, it does not really feel peaceful. It feels very temporary. Like the episode is taking a breath right before something happens. And that's what makes it effective, because you're no longer watching, wondering if something will go wrong. You're just waiting for when it happens. At this point in the episode, you can feel the tone shift in a really specific way. Not through anything obvious, not through a single big moment, but through momentum, because everything starts to feel like it's converging. Like all the earlier scenes, conversations, and small tensions are no longer separate threads. They're all pulling towards the same direction now. And the episode stops feeling like individual moments happening one after another, and starts feeling like single continuous build-up towards impact. An impact. The pacing doesn't speed up, but it feels faster because the silence between moments starts shrinking. There's less breathing room and less separation between scenes. Everything starts flowing into the next thing without giving you time to reset. And that creates this really specific tension where you're no longer reacting to what's happening. You're anticipating what's about to interrupt it. Even in quieter shots and even in calmer dialogue and even in the most controlled environments, there's this underlying sense that something is just off, waiting. One of the most noticeable things in this final part is how dialogue changes in feeling. Earlier in the episode, conversations felt slow and observational, but now they feel loaded. Even when nothing directly important is being said, the tone behind it feels way heavier. Like every sentence is carrying something unspoken underneath it. People aren't just talking anymore, they're carefully navigating what they say. And more importantly, they don't say it. The gap between spoken words and actual intent becomes wider, and that's where intention really lives now. Visually, the episode starts doing something subtle but effective. It holds. It doesn't cut away quickly, it lets moments sit, letting expressions linger a second longer than expected, and letting silence stretch out slightly past comfort. That's intentional, because when the show starts holding on to moments like that, it forces you to sit in the tension without moving past it. You're no longer being guided quickly from scene to scene, you're being left inside the moment. And that changes how you view everything. At this stage, this episode isn't really about new information anymore, it's about pressure accumulation. Everything that's been building since the beginning of the episode is now fully in motion underneath the surface. There's no more setup energy, and it's just continuation of escalation. Even calm interactions don't feel calm anymore. They feel very temporary, like they're happening right before something interrupts them. And that feeling starts to take over everything. And this is where the tone becomes really interesting, because if you compare it to earlier moments in the episode, the calm used to feel natural, but now it feels artificial. Like the world is holding on to something just long enough to reach the next turning point. And that creates a kind of psychological tension where you're not relaxed in any scene anymore. And even when nothing is happening, and even when the environment is still, you're still expecting and still anticipating still anticipating disruption. That's really effective about What's really effective about this final section is that it refuses to resolve that tension early. It keeps stacking and it keeps layering. It keeps pushing forward without releasing any pressure. So instead of traditional build and release structure, this episode leans fully into build and build and build and build. And that creates a very specific building. Fortnite. Anyway, that creates a very specific feeling, like, something is going to happen. And you just don't know when. That uncertainty is what keeps you locked in. By the time the episode starts moving forward, its final moments, everything feels aligned in a very deliberate way. Not explained, not spelled out, just positioned. Like, all the pieces are now in place. Now the only thing left for this situation is to actually tip over the edge. But the episode doesn't rush that moment. It holds you just before it, right before the episode. And anticipation becomes almost uncomfortable. That's where the final emotional state okay, not resolution, no payoff, but expectation. And that's where episode 6 leaves you, right at the edge of where nothing is fully broken yet, but everything feels like it's about to. And that's what makes this episode stand out in hindsight. It's trying to build a foundation of pressure that carries into everything that comes after it.